What would you do if the day after your wedding, your mother-in-law showed up at your door with a notary and an uncapped pen, demanding you sign away everything your grandfather left you? Most people would scream, fight, or break down. But I did something different. I stayed silent. Because silence isn't submission, it's strategy. And what happened next shocked even me. You see, they thought they were playing chess with a naive southern bride who didn't understand money. They had no idea I'd been 3 moves ahead since the day I said, I do. This is the story of how quiet strength became my greatest weapon. My name is Sarah, and I learned the power of silence from the wisest man I ever knew. My grandfather, growing up in a small town outside Dallas, I was always the quiet one. The daughter who listened more than she spoke. The one who watched from corners while my sisters demanded attention. My parents called me the easy child. But Grandpa Jack saw something different. Sarah, he'd say during those long summer afternoons on his porch, quiet don't mean weak. It means you're paying attention. He built his construction company from nothing. Started with a borrowed truck. And a toolbox, ended with contracts across 3 states. But he never forgot where he came from. Never forgot the value of hard work, integrity, and keeping your word. When I was 16, sitting in that same porch swing, he told me something that would change everything. One day, someone's gonna try to take what's yours, he said, his weathered hands folding over his coffee cup. They'll use pretty words, make promises, maybe even say they love you. But remember this, real love don't come with contracts. I nodded, not really understanding. Back then, I thought love was simple. Pure. I thought family meant protection, not predation. After high school, I moved to Austin for college. Business administration, nothing fancy. I worked part-time at a local bookstore, lived in a tiny apartment, and visited Grandpa Jack every weekend. He was getting older, slower, but his mind stayed sharp as a tack. You're gonna inherit something special, he'd tell me. Not just money, but responsibility. Don't let anyone convince you that being kind means being foolish. I graduated, got a job at a marketing firm, and started building my own quiet life. That's when I met Thomas Mitchell. 6'2", sandy brown hair, smile that could light up a room. He was everything I thought I wanted, charming, ambitious, from a good family. His mother, Patricia, was Dallas society royalty. Old money, charity boards, the kind of woman who measured worth by zip codes and bank balances. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Romantic dinners, weekend trips to his family's ranch, long talks about our future. He made me feel special, chosen. Like I was finally worthy of attention, but there were moments. Small things that made my stomach tighten. The way he'd answer his phone during our dates. How he'd glance at his watch when I talked about my grandfather. The subtle way Patricia would assess me during family dinners, like I was a business proposal she wasn't sure about. She's sweet, I overheard her tell Thomas one evening. But what exactly does she bring to the table? I should have listened to that warning bell. Should have remembered Grandpa Jack's words about contracts and pretty promises. But I was 24 and in love, and love made me deaf to wisdom. 2 months before our wedding, Grandpa Jack passed away. I held his hand in that sterile hospital room, watching his chest rise and fall with mechanical precision. The doctors said it was peaceful, but losing him felt like losing my compass. He was the only person who'd ever seen me, really seen me. The funeral was small. My parents flew in from Phoenix, my sisters from their respective cities. Thomas was there, of course, standing beside me in his perfect black suit, holding my hand with just the right amount of pressure. Patricia attended too, dressed in understated elegance, offering quiet condolences. After the service, everyone gathered at Grandpa Jack's house. I walked through rooms filled with memories, touching furniture he'd built with his own hands, running my fingers along bookshelves he'd carved during long winter evenings. That's when Mr. Harrison, his lawyer, pulled me aside. Sarah, he said quietly, your grandfather left specific instructions. Everything goes to you. I blinked, confused. Everything? The house, the company, all of it. But there's more. He handed me a sealed envelope. He said to give you this when you were ready to understand what it means to protect what's sacred. Inside was a letter in Grandpa Jack's careful handwriting. My dear Sarah, by the time you read this, you'll be wearing white and promising forever to a man I hope deserves you. But just in case he doesn't, I've made sure you'll never be powerless. The company isn't just a business, it's your independence. The house isn't just walls and a roof, it's your sanctuary. The trust isn't just money. It's your freedom to choose love over need. Never let anyone convince you that sharing means surrendering. Real partners build together. They don't demand blueprints to your foundation. Stay quiet, stay strong, and remember, silence gives you time to listen to who people really are. Love always, Grandpa Jack. I folded the letter carefully, my hands trembling slightly. Thomas was across the room, chatting with my sister about wedding details. He looked over and smiled, that same brilliant smile that had captured my heart, but for the first time, I wondered what that smile was hiding. Our wedding was perfect. At least, that's what everyone said. The venue was Patricia's choice, a historic plantation house outside Austin, complete with Spanish moss and antebellum charm. The flowers were her selection too, white roses and baby's breath, classic and expensive. Even my dress had her subtle influence. She'd accompanied me to the boutique and somehow steered me toward the most traditional option. You want to look timeless, she'd said, running her manicured fingers along the fabric. Not trendy. I should have noticed how every decision felt like a negotiation. How my preferences got gently redirected toward what was more appropriate for a Mitchell family wedding. But I was swept up in the romance of it all, the fairy tale ending I'd dreamed about since I was a little girl. Thomas looked handsome waiting at the altar. His best man, his college roommate Marcus, stood beside him. The church was packed with faces I barely recognized. Patricia's friends, business associates, people who'd known the Mitchell family for generations. My side of the church was noticeably smaller. My parents, my sisters, a few close friends from college. Mr. Harrison sat in the third pew, wearing the same black suit he'd worn to Grandpa Jack's funeral. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence stretched just a moment too long. I glanced at Mr. Harrison, and he gave me the smallest nod. Later, I'd wonder if he was trying to tell me something. The reception was elegant, expensive, everything Patricia had envisioned. But as the evening wore on, I started noticing conversations that stopped when I approached. Little huddles of Patricia's friends who'd smile and change the subject when I joined them. Such a lovely ceremony, one woman said, her voice honey sweet. And what a fortunate match for you, dear. Fortunate. Not happy. Not perfect. Fortunate. During the father-daughter dance, my dad leaned close to my ear. You sure about this, sweetheart? It's not too late to change your mind. I laughed, thinking he was joking. Dad, we're already married. Married ain't the same as committed, he said quietly. Remember that. The honeymoon was a week in Napa Valley. Thomas had booked a beautiful bed and breakfast, complete with vineyard views and morning room service. But even there, something felt off. He spent hours on his phone, talking to his mother, discussing family business that apparently couldn't wait. What kind of business? I asked one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. Just logistics, he said, kissing my temple. Nothing for you to worry about. There it was again. That dismissive tone, like I was a child who couldn't understand adult concerns. When we returned to Austin, Thomas suggested we move into the guest house on his family's property. Just temporarily, he said. Until we find our own place. But I had Grandpa Jack's house. It was beautiful, fully paid for, filled with memories I wasn't ready to abandon. When I mentioned this, Thomas got that look, the one I'd started recognizing. Patient but strained, like he was explaining something obvious to someone slow. Sarah, honey, that place is pretty isolated. And it's not really set up for a couple. Plus, Mom could use the help with managing the property. Managing the property. I was 24 years old with a business degree, and he was talking about me like I was a live-in assistant. But I was still in that honeymoon phase, still believing that marriage meant compromise. So I agreed to stay in the guest house for a month while we figured things out. That month turned into 3. Every time I brought up moving to my grandfather's place, Thomas had another reason why it wasn't practical. The commute was too long. The house needed updating. It would be better to sell it and invest the money in something more suited to our lifestyle. Our lifestyle. When had my life become our lifestyle? The morning everything changed started like any other. I was making coffee in the little kitchen of the guest house when I heard voices from the main house. Patricia was on the phone, her voice carrying across the garden. No, she hasn't signed anything yet, she was saying. But she will. Thomas is working on it. The girl's not exactly sophisticated about these things. I set down my coffee cup, my hand suddenly steady. Through the window, I could see her pacing on the back porch, phone pressed to her ear. The property alone is worth $2 million, she continued. And that's just what we know about. Thomas thinks there might be more. Business assets, maybe some investments the old man tucked away. My blood went cold. They were talking about Grandpa Jack's estate. About me. About our marriage. Trust me, Patricia's voice drifted across the morning air. By Christmas, everything will be properly organized. These small-town girls, they don't understand how real families handle money. I stood there for a long moment, letting the truth settle into my bones. Then I walked to the bedroom, opened my suitcase, and pulled out the sealed envelope Mr. Harrison had given me. Inside, along with Grandpa Jack's letter, was a second document I hadn't noticed before. A prenuptial agreement. Not the simple one Thomas and I had signed, but something more complex. Something that protected every asset I'd inherited. At the bottom, in my grandfather's handwriting, just in case love comes with a price tag. He'd known. Somehow, he'd known. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't pack my bags dramatically or leave a note. Instead, I did what my grandfather had taught me. I got quiet. That afternoon, while Thomas was at his office and Patricia was at her weekly bridge club, I drove to downtown Austin. Not to my grandfather's house, not to a hotel, but to a small law office tucked between a coffee shop and a vintage bookstore. The building was old, with creaky floors and walls lined with legal volumes. Mr. Harrison's office was on the second floor, cramped but comfortable. He looked up when I entered, his weathered face immediately concerned. "Sarah? What's wrong?" I sat down in the chair across from his desk and pulled out the prenup. "I need to know what this really says." He studied it for a long moment, his expression growing more serious with each page. Finally, he looked up. "Your grandfather was thorough. This document creates a trust structure that's almost impossible to penetrate. Everything you inherited is protected." "But Thomas and I signed a different prenup," I said. "A simpler one." "This supersedes that," Mr. Harrison explained. "Your grandfather filed this 6 months before he died. It's ironclad." I felt something loosen in my chest. "So they can't touch anything?" "Not a penny. Not the house, not the company, not even the checking account your grandfather set up for you." He leaned forward. "Sarah, what's this about?" I told him everything. Patricia's phone call, the subtle pressure to move away from my grandfather's house, the way Thomas dismissed my concerns about our future. Mr. Harrison listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "Your grandfather asked me to prepare something else," he said. "He called it his just-in-case plan. He was worried that someone might try to manipulate you through marriage." The folder contained documents I'd never seen before. Corporate filings, investment portfolios, property deeds. My grandfather hadn't just left me a construction company, he'd left me a business empire. "Sarah," Mr. Harrison said gently, "you're not just financially secure. You're wealthy. Your grandfather spent the last 15 years of his life building this for you." I stared at the papers, feeling overwhelmed. "Why didn't he tell me?" "Because he wanted you to choose love for the right reasons. But he also wanted to make sure you'd never be trapped if you chose wrong." That evening, I returned to the guest house with a new understanding of my situation. Thomas was already home, sitting on the small porch with a beer and his laptop. He looked up when I approached, smiling that familiar smile. "Hey, beautiful. How was your day?" "Productive," I said, settling into the chair beside him. "I visited my grandfather's lawyer. Just some loose ends to tie up." His smile faltered slightly. "Nothing serious, I hope?" "Just paperwork," I said casually. "Estate stuff. You know how it is." He nodded, but I caught the way his jaw tensed. Did you sign anything?" "A few things. Nothing major." That night, I lay in bed listening to Thomas breathe beside me. He was restless, tossing and turning, occasionally muttering in his sleep. Around midnight, I heard him get up and make a phone call from the living room. "She went to see the lawyer today," he whispered. "I don't know what that means." "No, I don't think she knows anything. She's not that smart." I closed my eyes, feeling the last of my romantic illusions crumble. Not that smart. After 2 years together, that's what he really thought of me. The next morning, I started my quiet exit. I began with small things. I stopped cooking elaborate dinners. I stopped asking about his day with genuine interest. I started spending more time away from the guest house, telling him I was visiting friends or running errands, but really, I was at my grandfather's house, going through his papers and learning about the empire he'd built. It was overwhelming at first. Holdings in real estate, investments in tech startups, partnerships with companies I'd never heard of. His construction business was just the tip of the iceberg. He'd been quietly building wealth for decades, always with the plan to leave it to me. Not because I was his only granddaughter, but because he'd recognized something in me that even I hadn't seen. I spent hours in his home office, surrounded by meticulous records and handwritten notes. There were letters he'd never sent, observations about people and business deals, even a journal he'd kept during my childhood. One entry, dated just after my college graduation, made me cry. "Sarah has her grandmother's wisdom and her mother's strength, but she doesn't know it yet. She thinks being quiet means being weak. Someone's going to try to take advantage of that kindness. I won't let them." 2 weeks into my quiet withdrawal, Thomas started noticing the change. He'd come home expecting dinner and conversation, but I'd be reading or working on my laptop. When he asked what was wrong, I'd smile and say nothing was wrong. "You've been distant lately," he said one evening. "Is everything okay?" I'm fine, I replied, not looking up from my book. Just thinking. About what? I looked at him then, really. Looked at him. About what I want my life to look like. He laughed, but it sounded forced. I thought we'd already figured that out. We never really talked about it, I said. We talked about your vision for our life. But not mine. The conversation ended there, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was starting to realize that his quiet, compliant wife might not be as manageable as he'd thought. What followed was the strangest month of my marriage. Thomas and Patricia began what I can only describe as a charm offensive. Suddenly, Patricia was inviting me to lunch at her country club. She'd pick me up in her silver Mercedes, chatting about family history and traditions as we drove through the manicured neighborhoods of Old Austin. You know, dear, she'd say over salmon salads and iced tea, the Mitchell family has always believed in keeping wealth in the family. It's not about greed, it's about legacy. These conversations always seemed casual, but I started noticing the pattern. She'd mention other young women who'd married into established families, how they'd transitioned their assets for tax purposes, how much happier they were once everything was properly organized. Take my friend Eleanor, Patricia would say, cutting her salad into precise pieces. She inherited a small chain of boutiques from her aunt. When she married Winston, they consolidated everything under the family trust. Now she has time to focus on what really matters: charity work, raising children, supporting her husband's career. I'd nod and smile, playing the role of the interested daughter-in-law. But I was taking notes, mentally cataloging every suggestion, every subtle pressure. Thomas, meanwhile, had become the perfect husband. He brought me flowers for no reason, planned romantic dinners, even suggested we start looking at houses together. I know staying with Mom hasn't been ideal, he said one evening as we walked through a beautiful colonial in Westlake. But I wanted to make sure we found the perfect place. Somewhere we can build our life together. The house was stunning. 4 bedrooms, a gourmet kitchen, a backyard that backed up to a nature preserve. It was also $3 million. It's beautiful, I said, running my hand along the granite countertops. But it's expensive. That's the beauty of combining our resources, Thomas said, his arm around my waist. Your grandfather's assets plus my family's investments, we can afford whatever we want. There it was again. Our resources. My grandfather's assets. Everything had become community property in Thomas's mind. That night, I called Mr. Harrison. Sarah? His voice was concerned. It's late. Is everything all right? I need to know something, I said, sitting in my car outside the guest house. If Thomas and I buy property together, does that affect the trust? Not if you're careful about how it's structured. But Sarah, what's this about? I told him about the house, about Patricia's lunches and her stories about other wives who'd transitioned their assets. Mr. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. They're testing you, he said finally. Seeing how far they can push before you push back. What should I do? Whatever feels right. But remember, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. Your grandfather made sure of that. The next day, I told Thomas the first wanted to think about the house. He was disappointed but understanding. Too understanding, like he was following a script. Of course, sweetheart. It's a big decision. Take all the time you need. But that evening, I overheard another phone call. This time, Thomas was in the garden, thinking he was out of earshot. She's stalling, he said, his voice frustrated. I don't know what she's waiting for. No, I don't think she suspects anything. She's just being typically indecisive. Typically indecisive. Another little knife, carefully placed. Look, Mom, maybe we need to be more direct. The trust thing is making me nervous. What if there's more money than we thought? What if she figures out what she's really worth? I pressed myself against the window, straining to hear. Okay. Christmas then. We'll make it official by Christmas. But if she keeps dragging her feet, we might need to consider other options. Other options. The word sent a chill down my spine. The next morning, Patricia called with an invitation. Sarah, dear, I'm hosting a little gathering this weekend. Nothing fancy, just some family friends. I'd love for you to meet them. The gathering was at the Mitchell family ranch, a sprawling property an hour outside Austin. The house was beautiful. All stone and timber, with views of rolling hills and grazing cattle. The guests were exactly what I'd expected. Wealthy, connected, the kind of people who made decisions over golf games and charity auctions, but it wasn't really a social gathering. It was a performance, and I was the star. This is Sarah, Patricia would say, introducing me to each couple. Thomas's wife. She's inherited the most charming property from her grandfather. We're helping her figure out the best way to manage it. Manage it. Not own it. Manage it. One man, a lawyer named Richard, was particularly interested in my situation. Estate planning is so important, he said, cornering me by the bar. Especially for young people who come into money unexpectedly. There are so many tax implications, legal complexities. You really need professional guidance. I have a lawyer, I said politely. Of course, but someone local might not understand the nuances of larger estates. I'd be happy to review your situation, offer a second opinion. I smiled and took his card, but I didn't miss the way Patricia watched our conversation with satisfaction. That night, driving home with Thomas, I asked him about Richard. Oh, he's great, Thomas said casually. He's handled our family's legal work for years. Mom thought he might be helpful with your estate stuff. I already have a lawyer. I know, but maybe it's worth getting another perspective. Someone who understands complicated financial situations. Complicated financial situations. As if I was too simple to understand my own inheritance, but I played along. Maybe you're right. I'll think about it. Thomas reached over and squeezed my hand. I just want what's best for you, Sarah. For us. What's best for us? The words I'd been hearing for months, always delivered with that same loving tone. But now I could hear what was underneath, the assumption that I couldn't make good decisions on my own, that I needed their guidance to navigate my own life. I squeezed his hand back, but inside, I was done pretending. The attack came on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 1 month before our first anniversary. I was in my grandfather's house, finally having moved back there despite Thomas's protests. He'd been understanding about it, of course, saying he respected my need for space to grieve. But I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he measured every day I spent away from his family's influence. I was sitting at Grandpa Jack's old desk, going through financial reports, when I heard a car in the driveway. Not Thomas's pickup truck, but a sleek black sedan. Through the window, I watched Patricia emerge from the passenger seat, followed by a man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase. They weren't alone. Thomas's truck pulled up behind them, and he got out wearing what I'd learned to recognize as his business expression, serious, determined, slightly apologetic. I met them at the front door, my heart already racing but my face calm. Sarah, sweetheart, Patricia said, her smile bright but her eyes cold. I hope you don't mind us dropping by. We brought someone I think you should meet. The man in the suit extended his hand. Mrs. Mitchell? I'm David Carlson, attorney with Carlson, Webb & Associates. I've been reviewing your estate situation at your mother-in-law's request. I shook his hand but didn't invite them in. I wasn't aware my estate needed reviewing. Well, that's exactly the problem, Patricia said, stepping around me into the house like she owned it. You're sitting on a significant amount of money with no proper management structure. It's financially irresponsible. They arranged themselves in my grandfather's living room like they belonged there. David opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. Thomas sat beside me on the couch, his hand on my knee in what was supposed to be a supportive gesture. Sarah, David said, I've done some preliminary research on your inherited assets. The tax implications alone are staggering. Without proper planning, you could lose a significant portion to estate taxes. I already have a lawyer, I said. Mr. Harrison has been handling my grandfather's affairs for years. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. Oh, honey, Harrison's a sweet old man, but he's not equipped for this level of complexity. David here specializes in high-net-worth estate planning. He saved our family millions. David nodded, spreading documents across the coffee table. Mrs. Mitchell, I've prepared a comprehensive restructuring plan. It would place your assets into a family trust, managed by experienced professionals. You'd still have access to everything, but with significant tax advantages. I picked up one of the documents. The language was dense, filled with legal terminology I didn't fully understand. But I caught the key phrases: managed by trustee. Board approval required, beneficiary access limited. This would give you control over my inheritance, I said, looking directly at Patricia. Not control, she said smoothly. Guidance. You're young, Sarah. You don't have experience managing this kind of wealth. We're offering to help. Thomas squeezed my knee. It makes sense, babe. Mom's been handling family investments for decades. She knows what she's doing. I looked at him, this man I'd married, this man who was supposed to protect me. And what do you get out of this arrangement? He looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, what's in it for you? For your family? David cleared his throat. Well, as your husband, Thomas would naturally serve as a secondary trustee. And there would be management fees, of course, but those are standard. How much? I'm sorry. How much would you charge to manage my inheritance? David glanced at Patricia, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. 3% annually, plus transaction fees. Very reasonable for this level of service. 3% of what I now knew was a multi-million-dollar estate. Every year. For the rest of my life. I need to think about this, I said, standing up. Patricia's mask slipped for just a moment. Sarah, dear, this isn't something you can postpone indefinitely. The tax implications alone, I said. I need to think about it. Thomas stood too, his face flushed. Sarah, you're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you. Are you? I asked. Or are you trying to help yourselves? The question hung in the air like smoke. David began gathering his documents, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. Patricia's smile had turned to stone. I think we should go, she said, her voice tight. Sarah clearly needs some time to consider what's best for her family. After they left, I sat in the living room for a long time, staring at the business card David had left behind. Then I picked up the phone and called Mr. Harrison. Sarah? You sound upset. They came here today. With a lawyer. They want me to put everything into a trust they would manage. I'll be right over. An hour later, Mr. Harrison sat in the same chair Patricia had occupied, but the energy in the room was completely different. He reviewed the documents David had left, his expression growing darker with each page. This is predatory, he said. Finally. They're not trying to help you, Sarah. They're trying to control you. Can they force me to sign? Absolutely not. But they can make your life difficult if you don't. As if on cue, my phone rang. Thomas. Sarah, I think we need to talk. Really talk. Can I come over? I'm tired, Thomas. Can we discuss this tomorrow? This is important. It's about us, about our future. The word us had lost all meaning. Tomorrow, I said, and hung up. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my grandfather's house, touching things he'd made, reading books he'd loved. In his bedroom, I found a small safe hidden behind a false wall. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. The first was a letter from a private investigator, dated 6 months before my wedding. The subject line made my blood run cold. Background check, Thomas Mitchell and Patricia Mitchell. The report detailed everything. Thomas's failed business ventures, always funded by his mother. Patricia's history of controlling her children's spouses, including Thomas's brother's wife, who'd eventually divorced him after losing access to her own family's money. There were bank records, court documents, even photographs of Patricia meeting with lawyers and financial advisors. At the bottom of the safe was a recording device and a note in my grandfather's handwriting, insurance policy. Just in case. I sat on the floor of his bedroom, surrounded by evidence of their deception, and finally understood. My grandfather hadn't just protected my inheritance. He protected my future. The next morning, I called David Carlson's office. Mr. Carlson? This is Sarah Mitchell. I've decided to decline your services. Mrs. Mitchell, I really think you should reconsider. I've already reconsidered. I'm satisfied with my current legal representation. Your mother-in-law won't be happy about this. My mother-in-law doesn't get to make decisions about my life. I hung up and immediately called Mr. Harrison. I need to see you today. It's time to stop playing defense. The confrontation came on a cold December morning, exactly 1 week before Christmas. I was ready for them this time. I'd spent the previous week working with Mr. Harrison, organizing evidence, preparing documents, and most importantly, setting up recording equipment throughout the house. Everything was legal, everything was admissible, and everything was about to come to light. Thomas arrived first, letting himself in with the key I'd never asked him to return. He found me in the kitchen, calmly drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. Sarah, we need to talk, he said, his voice strained. Mom's really upset about your decision. She's just trying to help. Is she? I asked, not looking up from the paper. Of course she is. We all are. But you're being stubborn about this, and it's causing problems for everyone. I folded the newspaper and looked at him. What kind of problems? Family problems. Money problems. Sarah, you don't understand how complicated this is. Then explain it to me. He sat down across from me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I'd fallen in love with. Vulnerable, uncertain, almost apologetic. My family has financial obligations. He said quietly. Investments, commitments. Mom's been managing things for years, but some of the older deals aren't panning out. She needs liquid assets to restructure. My assets. Our assets. Sarah, we're married. What's yours is mine, and what's mine is yours. Except you don't have anything that's yours, do you, Thomas? He flinched. That's not fair. Isn't it? You've never had a job that lasted more than 6 months. You've never paid rent, never owned property, never even had a credit card in your own name. Everything you have comes from your mother. That's not true. It's completely true. And now you need my money to bail out her bad investments. Thomas's face hardened. You're being cruel. I'm being honest. There's a difference. The doorbell rang, and we both knew who it was. Patricia entered like a storm, her usual composure cracking at the edges. Behind her came David Carlson, briefcase in hand, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Sarah, Patricia said, her voice sharp. I hear you've been making some very poor decisions. I've been making my own decisions, I replied. Maybe that's the problem. Don't get smart with me, young lady. I've been managing money since before you were born. I know what's best for this family. This family, I repeated. Interesting choice of words. Patricia's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? I stood up and walked to the counter, where I'd prepared a folder of documents. It means I know exactly what kind of family I married into. I placed the folder on the table and opened it. The first document was Thomas's financial history, every failed business venture, every debt his mother had covered. The second was Patricia's investment portfolio, showing years of declining returns and risky speculation. This is what you want my money for, I said. To cover your losses. Patricia's face went white. Where did you get these? Does it matter? The point is, I know the truth. You're not trying to help me manage my inheritance. You're trying to steal it. That's a serious accusation, David said, clearly uncomfortable. It's a serious crime, I replied. Which is why I've already filed a complaint with the State Bar Association. David's face crumpled. Mrs. Mitchell, I wasn't aware of all the circumstances. You weren't aware that they were asking you to help them commit fraud? Now wait just a minute, Patricia snapped. Nobody's committing fraud. We're trying to help you make smart financial decisions. By lying to me? By manipulating me? By having your son marry me for my money? Thomas stood up abruptly. That's not what happened. I love you, Sarah. Do you? Or do you love what I inherited? The question hung in the air like a blade. Thomas opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. His silence was answer enough. You want to know what I think happened? I said, my voice steady despite the storm in my chest. I think you and your mother researched my grandfather's death, found out about the inheritance, and decided I'd make a perfect target. A quiet, small-town girl with no family to protect her and no experience with money. That's not true, Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? When did you first ask me out, Thomas? Was it before or after you learned about Grandpa Jack's will? He didn't answer. He couldn't answer. Patricia stepped forward, her mask finally slipping completely. You ungrateful little bitch. We gave you everything. A good family, social connections, a future. And this is how you repay us? By refusing to be robbed? Yes, I suppose it is. You don't deserve what you inherited, she spat. You're nothing but a backwoods nobody with delusions of grandeur. I smiled for the first time all morning. You're right about one thing, Patricia. I am nobody special. But I'm nobody who owns something you want, and that's driving you crazy. I walked to the window, looking out at the oak tree my grandfather had planted when I was born. Its branches were bare now, but spring would come again. It always did. Here's what's going to happen, I said, turning back to face them. Thomas, you're going to pack your things and leave. Today. Our marriage is over. Sarah, please, he said. We can work this out. No, we can't. Because you never saw me as your wife. You saw me as your inheritance. And you, Patricia, I continued, are going to stay away from me. No more phone calls, no more visits, no more attempts to manipulate me through lawyers or family friends. You can't just, I can and I will. Because unlike you, I actually have money. Real money. Enough to hire the best lawyers in Texas and make your life very difficult if you continue to harass me. David was already packing his briefcase. Mrs. Mitchell, I think it's best if I withdraw from this matter. Coward, Patricia hissed. Realist, he corrected. Good luck to you all. After he left, Patricia made one final attempt. Sarah, you're making a terrible mistake. You need us. You need guidance, protection, someone to help you navigate. I need silence, I interrupted. And I need you to leave. You'll regret this, she said, her voice venomous. You'll see what the world is really like without family support. I'm looking forward to finding out. Thomas lingered after his mother left, his face a mixture of anger and something that might have been genuine regret. I did love you, he said quietly. In the beginning. Maybe, I replied. But you loved my money more. What happens now? Now you learn to stand on your own feet. Find a job, build your own life, stop depending on your mother to solve your problems. And us? There is no us. There probably never was. After they left, I sat in the living room for a long time, listening to the silence. It wasn't empty silence, it was full of possibility. For the first time in months, I could breathe. 6 months later, I was standing in the same spot where I'd confronted Thomas and Patricia, but the house felt completely different. Lighter. Like a weight had been lifted not just from my shoulders, but from the very walls. The divorce had been swift and decisive. Thomas had tried to claim spousal support, but the prenup my grandfather had prepared made that impossible. He'd walked away with nothing, just as he'd brought nothing to the marriage. Patricia had made good on her threats for a while. She'd spread rumors about me in her social circles, tried to turn mutual friends against me, even attempted to have my grandfather's will contested. But money, as it turned out, was very good at silencing gossip and deterring frivolous lawsuits. I'd used some of my inheritance to expand my grandfather's construction company, focusing on affordable housing projects and community development. It felt good to build something positive with the wealth he'd left me. The house had become truly mine again. I'd redecorated, removing all traces of Thomas's brief presence. But more than that, I'd filled it with life. Friends came for dinner. Parties. I'd started hosting a monthly book club for women in similar situations. Those who'd found themselves targeted for their wealth or trapped in manipulative relationships. On this particular evening, I was expecting a visitor. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock, and I opened it to find a young woman about my age, nervous but determined. "Are you Sarah?" she asked. "I am. You must be Jennifer." She nodded. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Jennifer was going through something similar to what I'd experienced. A whirlwind romance, a charming man from an established family, pressure to consolidate assets for tax purposes. But unlike me, she'd recognized the warning signs before signing anything. "I heard about your story through a friend," she said. As we sat in the living room, "I needed to talk to someone who'd been through this." "What's your instinct telling you?" I asked. "That something's wrong. But everyone keeps telling me I'm being paranoid." "Trust your instincts. They're usually right." We talked for 2 hours. By the end of the evening, Jennifer had a plan. She had resources, legal representation, and most importantly, she had validation that her concerns were legitimate. "How did you find the courage to walk away?" she asked as she prepared to leave. "I remembered what my grandfather taught me," I said. "That silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the strongest thing you can do." After she left, I walked out to the garden where my grandfather's oak tree stood, now full of spring leaves. I'd added a small bench beneath it, a place to sit and think when the world felt too complicated. The evening was warm, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant hum of traffic. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, naive, trusting, so desperate to be loved that I'd nearly given away everything that mattered. But I'd learned something important. Love shouldn't cost you your identity. A real partner builds with you, not off of you. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is loving yourself enough to walk away. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister. "Heard you're dating someone new. Tell me everything." I smiled, thinking of Michael, the contractor I'd met through the affordable housing project. He was kind, hardworking, and most importantly, he'd been building his own life long before he met me. Our relationship was growing slowly, based on genuine affection rather than financial strategy, but that was a story for another day. Tonight, I was content to sit beneath my grandfather's tree and appreciate the quiet strength that had carried me through the storm. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of peace. If you've made it this far, you know that sometimes the quietest voices carry the strongest truths. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between being liked and being respected? Drop a comment below and share your story. I read every single one, and your experience might help someone else find their courage.